Okay, we're looking now at exercise 4.28 and 4.30. Let's look at the instructions and then we'll hone in on the two exercises. For each of the following arguments, decide whether the conclusion is a tautological consequence of the premises. If it is, submit a proof that establishes the conclusion using one or more applications of taut con. This is important. Do not cite more than two sentences at a time for any of your applications of TopCon. We'll talk about why this is the case. We've talked about it a bit before, but we'll run a reminder because we haven't been in Fitch for a while. If the conclusion is not a tautological consequence of the premises, submit a counterexample world showing that the argument is not valid. So let me pull the window for Fitch over just a little bit so we're highlighting 4.28 and 4.30. Okay, so I've actually opened up the newer version of Fitch, and I have opened up exercise 4.28. So remember in Fitch, there are exercise files for you to open. They're pre-given. You don't have to create them. That said, you could certainly type in the argument and make the determination that we're meant to make here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the inference. I should be able to just copy and paste the conclusion. Good. So what am I asking here? I'm asking if the third sentence is a tautological consequence of the first two. And could I eyeball it? Sure, probably. Could I construct a truth table? Sure. But if I use TalkCon, I am asking Fitch to run a truth table in the background, and then I'm going to check to see if the inference follows. So the X tells me that the sentence A is large and either B or C is large is not a tautological consequence of the sentence either A or B is large and either A or C is large. So what we need to do now is build a world in which these two sentences are true. I'll go ahead and show the step numbers, in which sentence 1 and 2 are true, but sentence 3 is false. Now, for your benefit, I've constructed a truth table that shows that sentence 3 is not a tautological consequence of 1 and 2. And then, of course, here's the requisite world, requisite insofar as it meets the requirement of showing that sentence 3 is not a consequence of 1 and 2. There are other ways that you can build this world. But that is exercise 4.28. So let's move on now to exercise 4.30. Here's exercise 4.30. So you can probably see that just from the standpoint of the visual, it's a lot harder to eyeball whether or not the conclusion, A is a tet, is a tautological consequence of the premises. So again, we're going to ask Fitch to run a truth table in the background and tell us whether or not the inference is a tautological consequence, and we get a check mark. So that means that the argument is valid. That means that 4 follows from 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so what I'm going to do is delete the inference. And now let's start working on how we can apply a series of tautological consequence moves to demonstrate that the conclusion, A as a tet, follows from the premises. So let's remind ourselves of two ideas we already know. We know the concept of tautological equivalence or truth table equivalence or truth functional equivalence. So for example, we can see that the sentence, it's not the case that both, is tautologically equivalent by way of the De Morgan's law, to it's not the case that B, or it's not the case that C. The other idea that we have is the the concept rather, of elimination. Namely, if we have a disjunction, one side of which is rejected, that leaves us with the other side. So that may be a way for us to move forward as well. The equivalence between the negation parentheses tet B and tet C, and it's not the case that tet B, or it's not the case that tet C, is an equivalence that allows us to substitute one sentence for its equivalence, which is an inference. In other words, the substitution is an inference. So let's do that first. Either A is a tet, or it's not the case that B is a tet, or it's not the case, oops, that C is a tet. I forgot to put my negation in front, which I'm doing now. And I am asserting that this is a tautological consequence. We're being told that, oh, the sentence is not well formed, and that's because I put a conjunction rather than a disjunction. Again, that's a nice reminder that Fitch will tell us if we've, typically will tell us if we've done something wrong. All right, so we've got our first tautological consequence. What else can we do? Well, we know that the sentence, it's not the case that either, is equivalent to it's not the case that one, and it's not the case that the other. Now, for the sake of showing each of the steps, I'm going to push the negation through and change the disjunction to a conjunction to substitute the equivalent sentence, but I'm going to preserve the interior negations, and then I'll remove them. So we get the following. Sentence 2 is equivalent to sentence 5 by way of a tautological equivalence. So we've got a taut con. Now, strictly speaking, at line 6, we would remove one set of double negations, and then on the next line remove the other. But for the sake of efficiency, let's make the equivalence move twice so that we do it on one line. So we get tet B and tet D, and that's really a double negation removal. So we've got two taut cons there. Now let's pause a moment. Let's not forget where we're going. We want tet A, right? So what we're going to want to be able to do eventually is eliminate tet A from this disjunction. Now while we're here, notice that tet B contradicts not tet B at line 4. So I can say if both B and D are tets, then it follows that B is a tet, and B being a tet contradicts not tet B at line 4, which then gives us tet A, or it's not the case that C is a tet. Now, we've used our first two sentences, and you should bear in mind that when we're working through a derivation, we will use every sentence that's given or derived, so nothing is superfluously derived. nothing is superfluously given. So that means we need to say something about line 3, but also we need to say something about line 3 because that's going to help us get to get to our conclusion. So notice that in line 3 we're told that either both E and C are tets or both C and D are tets. That means that tet C is common to each side of the disjunction. So we can infer that C is a tet and either E or D are tets. Now, if C is a tet and this other stuff is the case, then that means that C is a tet. Remember our truth definitions for the conjunction. If a conjunction is true, that's because each conjunct is true. So we can infer by tot con, line 10 from line 9, we're ready to draw our inference. Right? If A or not C is a tet, but it turns out that in fact C is a tet, notice that 10 and the right side of line 8 contradict each other, that means that A is a tet. Now let's check our proof, and we get not only a confirmation at each step that we have made correct inferences, but we've also reached our goal.